I am shocked at how much it costs now to publish, given that everything's online, it's done electronically, there's not a lot of paper involved. But that's something that you probably should, have up front. And then before you publish or before you publicly disclose it is, does the research have patentable information? Now, that's not as big a deal in academia, but I came from a corporate background, and the last thing you want to do is publish a paper, because what happens is once you publish it, it's publicly disclosed, you can no longer go back and patent it. You've kind of, what I say, poisoned the well for everyone. There is a strategy to do, there is a publication strategy to publish to keep people from patent things. But if you think you have anything in your research that needs to be patentable, I encourage you to talk to the Curlincon Innovation Department to make sure that that everything's in place, because you do want to make sure. This even includes abstracts of scientific meetings. That happened to me one time. We published an abstract, and patent lawyers can find those things, even if it's a meeting that you thought, who's going to find this abstract that I published, in a meeting 3 years ago. They'll find it, and it'll negate your ability to write a patent. So the next thing is, before you type your first word, you really want to introduce yourself to the clinical librarian if you haven't already. We have a very excellent staff, both at the medical school and at Carilion Clinic. They're very collegial. Radford University Carilion with Jamie is excellent person too. Jamie Price, I still rely on him since I have a adjunct faculty position with Radford. And maybe what you want to do is request a literature review of your topic of interest if you haven't done one already. You can do one on your own, but it's kind of good to have a professional do that literature search for you so that you've uncovered all the publications. It's not necessarily going to use all these when you publish, but at least you have them. Also inform a statistician or your statistician that you plan to write a manuscript. I think in this days and age, people used to try to do their own stats. It's not going to fly anymore, and there's plenty of resources here between Maddie Tenser's group and Alex Hanlon's group for you to get statistical help. I'm sure Radford has their folks too. The next one is actually for people on the phone, on this call or on this presentation that got their PhD, is make sure you inform your supervisor, even if they're not a co-author. That's the best way to get off on the wrong foot with your boss or your mentor or your PhD mentor, is to be basically publishing a manuscript that they don't know anything about. That doesn't mean they're an author, but you really need to be transparent about what you're doing. And then lastly, select a reference management software. I came from the days where you kind of kept all these references in Word documents and Excel spreadsheets. Don't do that anymore. Make sure you use one of these nice, reference software databases. Sherry, go ahead. You have a question?
I was just clapping because that's so important nowadays. I think that several times the reference management, it was like the bane of my existence. So yes, absolutely. Good point.
I'll get to that in the end too. So there's a couple ones that are free, like Mendeley, and that was really popular when I was over at Radford. But I think one of the things that people really like is EndNote, and I put an asterisk there. You can order EndNote through Edison, an Edison request, and they have to buy it, and they will install it on your computer. Some of us that have a VT faculty appointment, you can actually get one through your faculty appointment, but I highly recommend you do this sooner than later to get this reference management software in place. And if anybody wants to comment on which one they find the best, I know some come in favor and out of favor. Again, Mendeley was very popular maybe 4 or 5 years ago. EndNote's kind of, I think, kind of the gold standard that's been around for a while. So here's a list of digital references to facilitate writing articles in the health and biological sciences. Again, you'll see right down there, about 2/3 of the way down, the management of references. The other one that I want you to make sure, especially maybe somebody that's here from the med school, can talk about having an ORCID account. And this is something that kind of identifies you in the world of publications, and it actually can be set up to find publications. I was on a publication a few months ago, and I went into my elements for the medical school, saw that it had already got populated without me putting it in. So that was very nice. And yeah, you can look at these for you'll have access to these slides for these databases. So the next big question is what constitutes an author? It's really not your family or friends. In most cases, in some cases, not even, the person you work for. So there are four components that really need to be necessary for an author is they should have significant involvement in these 4 points. They should be involved in the study concept or design, the data collection or data analysis interpretation. They should have some aspect of drafting or revising the manuscript, approval of final version, and they're also responsible for the accuracy and integrity of all aspects of the reported research. Please avoid ghost or gift authorship. It's really just not ethical to do that. You shouldn't be putting authors on there as a favor. So just avoid that. And I don't think any of you on this call would be doing that. So the order of authorship is the first author usually writes the paper or is the major competitor. And the last author, I used to say, is the boss or your advisor or the corresponding author. And it's usually, at the very end of the thing. So you can have co-authorship. I've never had a co-authorship paper. I think it kind of gets kind of dicey because it's like usually both people aren't very pleased with being co-authors, but you can have it. It's signified by an asterisk. So when you look at a manuscript, authorship is populated by what I call outside in. So you have the first author wrote the paper in most cases, and the last author is really the project leader. And as they move towards the center, that's the order of importance. So it's nice to be kind of right there in the middle of the paper, but really the middle of the paper is really the people that did the least probably. Somebody can dispute me on that. This differs from patent authorship where there's no assigning of the author's name. It's just listed. They could be alphabetical order, but in a patent, you don't have it so that one author has more power than the other. But it's real important that, again, the first and last author. It's great to be the first author because that's what it's going to come up as. It's going to come up as Smith et al. In all the literature searches. The first author, go ahead, yeah.
Sorry, Francis. I was just going to say this really it tends to vary depending on your field or discipline. So it's slightly different, I think, for medical education. So when we think about medical education research as opposed to clinical research, I think usually the first author, some folks like to say, is the person who writes the outline, does most of the work. Everybody's involved in writing the paper, but the senior author tends to be more in like in the expert role, in the advisory role, that type of thing. And just like you said, you work outside in. I tend to see the first and last author is most important, and then the second author coming next, and after that, just third, fourth, whatever. In medical education specifically.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and good. That's because other disciplines it is different. The other thing too is the first author could be the corresponding author, but generally it's the last author that again has the responsibilities for being the corresponding author. That doesn't mean though that the first author, in most cases, at least in my role, I've always was the one that submitted it. Not your mentor. So writing a manuscript though is usually I think it's inside out. So this shows it, with the title abstract up top and the acknowledge and references and moving towards the middle. I tend to like to write papers inside out. So I think the easiest way to get started, let's all pretend we have wider block, is your methods. Methods should be, that's what you do. It should be really easy to write your methods and then your results and your tables and figures. And one of the things I like about, those two things starting with there is a lot of times your results, your tables and figures, you've presented publicly in some forum. Again, you don't want to disclose too much like in a real big public forum, but internally, you've made a PowerPoint presentation. You've seen how the data kind of goes with the audience. So those are the two building blocks, I think, before you do some of the other components. And again, we can discuss whether people feel like that's the easiest way to go or not too. So when you write your methods section, or in my case, a lot of times when I was doing, biological sciences, it was called methods and materials. So in this section, your researcher should be able to replicate your study. So think about this as your recipe or script. It needs to be pretty exact. Somebody needs to be able to follow it exactly how you did your thing. Items to include in this section would include the overall study design, If it's a clinical trial, your inclusion, exclusion criteria, your statistical methods and power, you'll put your IRB approvals here, and then list your equipment and reagents. And so your methods section should mirror the results section in the same order if possible. So in other words, what you wrote first in your methods section should be first in your results section. So results should provide an adequate and complete description of the data. And this is the most important point if you leave with nothing else, without providing interpretation. You're going to have time in other places to put in interpretation, but results are the results. It's kind of like the news. It's like it should just be exactly reporting exactly what you found. And let your tables and figures drive this section, with the results text and figure legends playing a supplemental role. So the way when I was thinking about this presentation is, think about if you were given a PowerPoint presentation, there was no presenter. Can somebody figure out what you're doing without an audio interpretation is given? So that's the way you want to think of your results section. The other thing you want to put in your results section is you really want to provide the raw data. So it shouldn't, in this place, you don't want to use averages, percentages, ratios, etc. You can put in some. But really, this is where you put your real numbers. You'll have a place to put basically what I call the data that's been processed. So it's real important that you put your raw data in your results section. So your tables and figures, they should be self-explanatory. If you have statistical symbols like p-values, it's good to have them in the figure itself, so people don't have to look and say, well, does that bar graph look, did they reach significance? And so to have those made. Again, I'm an old timer, and making figures and tables and stuff used to be kind of difficult, and you used to make, I'm dating myself, we used to make slides, and then from your slides you make your figures. Now, with Photoshop and all the other various softwares, table and figures aren't as difficult as they were back in my day. Another thing that you want to do is determine what's best represented by a table versus a graph or figure. So, if you look at like the New England Journal of Medicine and looking at clinical trials, the demographic data should always be in a table, whereas any of the data that's been collected over time should either be in a graph, a bar graph. So those are the two things that you want to kind of look at. One of the things you want to do is avoid representing the same information in a graph and a table, because it just gets redundant for the researchers, and it kind of just complicates your publication. The other thing you want to do for an introduction is you want to be concise and avoid writing a review. There's usually everybody knows reviews, you can get reviews. That's not your goal there. And believe it or not, 3 paragraphs might be sufficient in most cases for your introduction. So what you want to do is you want to introduce the topic and what is known, but it's also important to know what is not known. And this is really why you're going to get your publication accepted. So you should put the objective of your study and how it will add to the general scientific knowledge. And this is the place too where you put your hypothesis. And through the introduction, this should be littered with all the relevant references that form the basis of your work. Again, it's different from writing your PhD thesis. The introduction really should just be giving people a flavor, because generally people that are going to be looking at your publication are in that field. They're not just reading, your stuff for casual reading. So your readership is going to be familiar with all the key references, but you need to make sure they're in there and just kind of cite them. Don't sort of, really expand upon them. So the discussion is where the first paragraph is where you have a summary of the results, focusing on answering your research question. And then the second paragraph is, how does your work build on what is known in the literature? Is it consistent with what is known? Or if it's different, compare and contrast with present knowledge. And in this section is where you have your summary data. This is where you go, a trend was seen. Over time, this was observed. And this is where you can put your percent changes, averages, ranges, because people can go back to the results section and see what the absolute numbers were for some of the things you put in the discussion. The other thing too is, I don't think you want to go overbound on your discussion. Again, you want to keep it fairly tight. I think you can keep it down to 3 to 4 paragraphs. And in that third paragraph is list the strengths and limitations of your data. It's real important that you point that out. And what future questions or studies should be asked based on the results. And then it's really good to avoid overinterpretation, because I think when somebody reviews your paper, they, in some ways, they might be going along and thinking everything's good, but then they're like, wow, I think they're really stretching it from the data that I've, read and reviewed. And then do an overall conclusion in 1 to 2 sentences. So then again, I'll be happy. I'll be willing. I want to know when we get to discussion here if this is the order that you do it, because this is how I literally do it. I write the title and the abstract last. In some ways, because the abstract is based on kind of like how the whole paper kind of came together. But you have to take the title very seriously with the authorship too, because this is how you're going to be cited in the bibliographical databases. So make sure you keep your title concise and that it reflects exactly what you're finding. And so make sure you adhere to some of the rules of the journals. But again, I put some thought into your title. Don't make it too long. Your abstract, the way I always tell, like when I'm teaching, it's they use the word elevator pitch, and 250 words or less. What did you do? What did you find out in this study? So it needs to be specific, clear, unbiased, concise, standalone, because again, a lot of times your abstract will also get into these databases. People read their abstract and say, okay, well, let me go, get the source document for this. And it needs to be scholarly. Again, don't use jargon. Most of the papers that I've published, it was basically a Word document or paragraph. I'm noticing that a lot of journals now are going to a more mandated structural format where you're looking at it's like objectives, results, conclusions, etc. I kind of like those visually when you read some other papers. I personally don't like writing them that way. And I know when I first got here for research day, that's the way they were structured. And so maybe just because I'm showing my age, we went back to basically where it's just free text where you write a paragraph. So again, I'd be interested to see whether they like the structured format or the unstructured format. In this section 2 is where you're going to have to supply your keywords and your mesh headings. So you're starting to get to the home stretch, of writing your paper, but there's a few other things that you still need to do. And this is now where that reference management software database comes in. So the journal will specify how they want the references to be done, and they're not all the same, obviously. So the nice thing is your reference database will allow you to pivot between different journal styles without you having to do it yourself. This is very, very important if you have a good database of your references. And as most of you know that have published a lot, not every paper gets published. And a lot of times you go for a real high tier journal and you have to start coming down a little bit. And so they will have different ways they want their references to done. Very important thing, and I found this really frustrating, is try to cite original source rather than a review or a meta-analysis. So the worst thing to do is you say, oh, what's that reference? And when you go back and you look at it, it's a review article, and the data that you're really looking for is now buried in some other reference. So make sure, you kind of have the reference so that if you're making a key point, that people can go back to the original reference. You should consider the evidence, your publication and quality. Again, this is something we can talk about in discussion. In the biological sciences, generally, you're not going to reference something from 20 years ago. It's not that that wasn't important 20 years ago, but really it's not really relevant, probably especially like in molecular biology, it just moves so fast. And then ensure accuracy. Again, I think this is easier now than it was in my day, but it's frustrating for a reader to be led to a wrong reference. At my last company, it was really nice. The library actually would check your references to make sure they all match out. It's one of the things, I guess it's because it was a corporate world. They wanted to make sure that no errors were done with that. So that was, I don't think we have that service here, but it was a nice one. So acknowledgments. And again, I hope we can talk about this. This can be a sensitive topic. And the question you want to ask is someone a co-author or acknowledged? So some of the general things I think about for acknowledgement is, did they provide a reagent but did not participate in the project? They really should be a acknowledgement, not an author. I think it's not ethical for somebody to say, okay, I'll let you have my antibody, but you need to make me an author. That's really not the way science should be done. If there's secretarial general editing, that should be acknowledgement, as a courtesy. A non-study colleague, if they added something to it, your support staff. And in some cases, this is where you're gonna have to decide, is your statistician a acknowledgement or is it a co-author? And again, that's something you should establish up front when you're kind of setting out your papers. The other thing that you'll see too in some journals, and I think I see this more and more, is you have to acknowledge the contribution of each author in a short note. They'll say like Sherry Wicker, manuscript, draft, and then there'll be like, somebody else and what they did. And so there's acknowledgement, so kind of acknowledge people that helped you with it, and then there's acknowledgement that's actually required by the journal. So I'm going to stop here. If anybody has any questions, and I'm going to take you through a journal, and this is kind of the checklist, and we can talk a little bit more about things. Any questions at this point? So I'm going to pretend we're all a pulmonologist, and so we want to publish in the Chest Journal, which is, the American Thoracic Society. It's a pretty prestigious journal. So it's hard to get into that. And let me see if I can click on this link and it'll open. So here's his, you're looking at, an online format, Chest Journal. Here's a paper right here that we could look at a little bit. There's a PDF that that you can download, etc. So if we go to the next slide, when you go to the journal, the place you want to look for is for authors, here where the arrow is. And so I'm going to go through, again, this is for just this journal, which is a medical journal for pulmonologists, and just go through some of the finer points about submission that I think carry for most journals. So on this slide here, you'll see that they actually use an editorial manager to submit the paper. So in my day, I'm old enough to know that you really used to send 3 or 4 copies in a FedEx envelope and mail it. And so that's not done anymore. It's now done electronically, and there's a system that you need to use. And it says here, submissions received by email or mail will not be considered, and you're going to get a tracking number. The other thing that's true with this journal, but not all journals, and again, we can have this with discussions, you're encouraged to provide names of qualified reviewers who have experience with the subject matter. And that doesn't necessarily mean that those are going to be selected, but you can suggest people that you think should review your work. That's true, like with PNAS is another journal. So this is unique for this, not unique for this journal, but it wasn't, I didn't think this was that common when I was publishing a lot, is they use the double anonymized review. So the identities of the authors are concealed from the reviewers and vice versa. And that, I think, really didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. And again, we can discuss about this, because I know when I was reviewing manuscripts, you knew exactly where they came from. And I think this is very nice that Chest has this basically double blind process. So these are the elements that you have. So if you've written this paper, and this is where now getting a manuscript is like a grant submission. So you need to have a cover letter, you need to have the title page, and this title page will have all the information, your personal information. Then the manuscript itself will not have your name on it. And this is what's going to go out to the reviewers. You need to come up with keywords, abbreviation, the abstract goes in, text, then the acknowledgements, then your references, tables, figure legends, figure files. And then we didn't talk a little bit about supplemental material, but some of your figures probably won't be able to make it into the publication. But if you think they really add to your manuscript, you can put them there. This is where you'll have your permissions if necessary. If it's a clinical trial, they'll want to pay, at least for this journal, they want the patient consent. And then you'll have to fill out a conflict of interest form. Later on, you'll have to fill out a copyright form too. So why this is important is you've decided that you and 10 of your co-authors are going to publish this paper together. You're going to have to get these conflict of interest forms from all 10 of your investigators. And in some cases, these people are busy. They might have gone to another institution. So this is a job in itself, is tracking down all these people, because the journal will want it from every one of the authors on the manuscript. So then the abstract structures, so again, we talked about an unstructured versus structured. So Chess uses a structured format, and this is for the original research studies, clinical trials, interventional studies, etc. So there's going to be a background. You have to put the research question, study design and methods, results, interpretation, and the clinical trial registration. So for some of the other articles, and you can see if you go to the Chess Journal, they'll have reviews, they'll have non-clinical trials, clinical research. They use the standard abstract format, but for the clinical trials, interventional studies, you need to have these 6 components in your abstract. References here, it says authors are responsible for accuracy and completeness of citation. So one of the things that I noticed in this for Chess Journal is they number them, sequentially. So the first reference should be the first reference, in your references. I used to really like never published in Cell, but I used to like the Cell Journal, and they used to use the name. So it'd be like Wicker et al., and that would be in your references there. I think as a reader, when I'm reading manuscripts, I'd rather see the name, an et al. Than just a number. And I think Sherry brought this up back, people that have been around publishing for a long time. A lot of this was done by hand, and it was real easy to get your numbering messed up. And so you're all ready to get everything done, and then you find something's wrong and you got to fix it. Again, I can't stress enough about having a reference management software to take care of this. But again, this journal is where they're numbered sequentially. So journal, and so reference 1 should be in your intro, and it's going to be in your references. There's 1, 2, and so they do it this way. Not all journals do it this way. I'll be curious to see what people prefer or are used to. So again, style of usage. You'll have these slides. The Chess uses the AMA manual of style. And again, I'd be interested to see anybody's looked at this. I had not looked at this prior to putting this presentation together. I think you have to pay for this. So maybe the libraries have the manual style. It's kind of funny that if you go to this site, there's quizzes on, it gives you, it's kind of could be a good teaching exercise. It gives you an unstructured abstract, and it makes you put it into the headings. So I think that'd be cool. I might use that in my teaching. It also tests you on abbreviations. So again, I don't know how much this costs, but it might be something more worth looking into, especially if you publish, medical articles. So you've submitted it off, you're all happy. And then weeks later, sometimes it can be as much as a month, you're going to get 3 answers. We regret to inform you that, we didn't accept your paper. Thanks. And this is where you now go bring your group back together. What do you want to do next? Let's repackage it. What journal we're going to go to next? The next thing that's a little bit happier is we're happy to accept it with revisions, and these revisions need to be done, or these experiments need to be done for you to get accepted. And then lastly, which doesn't happen that much, is we're happy to accept it without revisions. And so that's what that's when you kind of toast that you've made it. So one of the things that you need to do, if you get the number 2, we're happy to accept it with revisions. Don't dilly-dally. A lot of times there'll be a time frame, and they'll want it back in a matter of weeks with these revisions that are given. And again, if you have a lot of co-authors, you've got to get it all back together, and you've got to get agreement that this is what we're going to do. One of the things too is if you get a number 1, generally you do go to another journal and try somewhere else. But if you think the reviewers are totally off base, you can email the editor for adjudication. That happened in one of my early on when I was in grad school. Is we basically said we just think these reviewers are just being over the top, and we sent that to the editor of the journal, and she agreed with us, and we did get our paper accepted. So that was nice to know there. Once you're fully accepted, you'll have a short window to make any last minor changes. And it used to be like galley proofs. And I think a lot of times you get them and you have to turn them around in 24 to 48 hours. And so don't take this lightly, because the last thing you want to do is have an error or you have to fix something, because then that now could be searched, because if you look at a typical journal, there's all the nice articles, and then at the bottom, there's your retractions and your errors and things like that. That's the last thing you want to do is, have a citation that, you got cited because you made an error. And then you also have to sign the copyright to the journal. And again, every one of the co-authors has to do this. So again, you're assembling your team, and you make sure you communicate with your team. So this is especially important if you're just throwing somebody on there just as a favor for their author. It might come back to get you, because you can't keep track of these people if they're not sort of in your little group. And again, take the steps to avoid correcting errors later. So I think that's my last slide. So I kind of just like to open it up for discussion and see what people think, or maybe some of their experiences they've had with publishing.
Thanks so much for this helpful information, Francis. I am currently with the group revising and editing for Flow, one of the manuscripts we're working on. And I just want to take all of this. I'm counting on my fingers how many days it'll take for me to get the video up. But I think I'm just going to take your presentation and use it this very evening to apply some of your concepts, just to make sure it was so practical with, within the introduction section, within the method section, which also happens to be my favorite, the method section, just to make sure all of those elements that you mentioned are included in there. It really helps to have a little checklist.
Yeah, thanks.
There were some comments in the chat. So let's see. Roger Smith said some mainstream journals will not accept manuscripts where the majority of the material has been presented elsewhere. Very true. You've got to be very careful with that. If you're going to submit it somewhere else, you got to make sure that it's significantly different than where you've had it published otherwise. And then Roger also says, if anyone is interested in publishing in the OBGYN literature, I'm an editor on the Journal of OBGYN and would be happy to advise on this or other journals. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. That's lovely.
Happy to be of help.
Awesome. Let's see.
NAS journal, you really can't get published in there unless you know an academy member, somebody in the academy. And so it is good to know people like Dr. Smith, where you need to rely on your colleagues.
Absolutely. And there's always, if you know somebody else is even published in a journal, sometimes it's helpful to say, what do you think was made you successful in getting this published? And I think that can be very helpful.
You have to know your journal too, because the journals tend to have a different, they all have their different sort of takes on how they want to present things. So you really need to understand the audience that reads that journal and the kinds of things that they present. I found that with manuscripts, while I could use the same manuscript, if one rejected the work, I couldn't just submit it to another one. I really had to kind of tweak a little bit and make it more appropriate to the journal I was submitting to, because they really, in a sense, have all their own personalities that you have to pay attention to and their own requirements.
You're so right. And there are general journal requirements, and then you look at the different types of articles within that journal, right? And there are different criteria for each of them. So there may be original research, there may be letter to the editor, or editorial, or more developmental process articles. So they all have their different idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, the other thing I didn't mention, and I don't want to get goofy with you guys, but let's pretend we're artists. These are our paintings. You know what I mean? You should be so proud of your manuscripts. And I still get excited, the acceptance of your last paper as opposed to your first paper. because it really is a big deal to, to get it done and get it published and it's out there. And what's cool now is, it used to be, you publish it being a journal, to being a library, and you'd have to track it down. And now it's there on public databases, and you go to Google Scholar and put in somebody's name, and there it is. And so I like that aspect now of the modern days of how everything is so trackable.
And if you do sign up for, like for example, in Elements, for Virginia Tech faculty members, and you sign up for ORCID through there, or one of the other, there are some competing services, but then like ResearchGate and things like this, and it will sometimes contact you and say, hey, did you write this paper? Is this you? And there have been times when it's not me. It may be somebody with a similar name to mine, who's a specialist in neurosurgery or something. And I'm like, nope, you do not want an article that I have written on neurosurgery. But a lot of times you say yes, and then it goes right into your database for, is captured right in there without you having to enter it.
Yeah, thanks. Sure. I was in Elements like a week or two ago, and what it does is it brings up all the papers they think are you, and you either reject or accept it. And if and so a couple of those were feral for somebody in England that was nuclear physics. But it is nice that, again, I didn't have to put it in, work it count it for me. I just have to accept it, and then it goes into your Elements. So maybe I'll pick on somebody here. Sarah, you just recently got your PhD. So maybe you want to give your experience with submitting a manuscript recently.
I think, Sarah, are you talking? I hear her, so she's either talking on a call or talking without being unmuted. That's okay, we'll come back to her. She must have had to grab a call. Other thoughts from other folks who have submitted recently or have had different experiences with a variety of journals? I know generally a lot of times.
It looks like Dr. Wolf is gonna
go for it. Lori.
Hey, I'm sorry I missed half of this meeting. I'm kind of bearing my soul here all of a sudden, but we have done some work in telemetry in our simulation lab. It was about a year-long project, and I think is really good work. And we have submitted it to several different journals, and it's been rejected like a desk rejection, because we just can't find the right home for it. I don't think anybody's really even read it thoroughly. I don't feel insulted that they didn't like the work. It's just that it's not the right venue. So this is the first time I've ever experienced that. Usually people approach me saying, hey, write a paper on this, and you write the paper and there it goes. So this is the first time I've done work. I think people need to know about it out in the world. I think I'd like it to go outside of the human factors world, because I think other sciences need to hear this stuff, but we're just struggling where to put this. We brought it to Sarah Parker's lab meeting, and they were very helpful. They even had a suggestion of another place we could submit it. But so I don't know if anybody has advice, but I totally agree with what was it, Sherry? Someone said earlier how you have to modify your paper. Because we've had to change it, and not change, just change the focus and the structure and the format a bit for each different submittal that we've done. So if anybody has any advice on that, I'd be glad to hear it.
Yeah, you wish you could find a list of all the possibilities out there, which would be endless. I mean, there's so many of them, but you're right, finding the right journal. And there are so many of them out there that I've never even heard of. You can get on.
You can call them up and just say, hey, I got this topic. Is that kind of a right fit?
Yeah, exactly.
There's also a service called Jane. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but you can go ahead and type some keywords, put your abstract in there, put your whole article in there, and it will pull up a variety of journals that would be appropriate, a good fit for your particular article. So that might be a really good step. But Lori, I love your point, right? I always think that every article has a home. You just have to find it.
And it's actually the journal author name estimator. I put the link in the chat, Lori. I don't know if you've ever used it before, but you can either put like keywords or an abstract or a title in there, and it does come up with a list of potential journals. I mean, it's not always spot on, but it might give you, some unique options that you haven't tried yet.
Oh,
I'm
good.
totally using that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Because we have the whole thing written, and we've written it several different times. So, and that sometimes you submit it one place, like we tried BMJ, that was our first one. BMJ, patient safety quality, said, no, it's too technical. Send it to the BMJ IT technical part. And so we did that, tweak a little bit, sent it. And then they said, nope, it's too much like safety quality. So then we had to go a whole new direction. But then that, oh gosh, AMIA, I believe, is where we sent it next. And then they suggested another place for it, and that's what we're trying. So we're just kind of following where they suggest, but this would be a more proactive way. I'm going to put our whole abstract in and see what it says. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much.
Some of the times when I've submitted a manuscript to a journal and I get rejected, it's the best thing that could have happened. It might not be a great fit for that journal, but the editors gave such amazing advice, like line by line, step by step, or big concepts. Like this would be so much better, that the paper ends up being way better, after it's modified based on their recommendations. So some of the journals are really good for that.
Yeah, the other thing we talk about is impact factor. So every journal is assigned an impact factor, and so that kind of gauges, where you should publish and where you shouldn't. And then we didn't talk a little bit about the H index, but that's something we can talk about in another presentation about, that is assigned to you. And if you do a search on yourself in Google Scholar, it will assign an H index to you because it does it in the back of the book. The other thing too, again, this is talking a little out of school, is it's very disappointing when your paper gets rejected, but even though it's anonymous process and stuff, it is an art to get things published and stuff. And I know, again, when I was a grad student and postdoc, I was reviewing papers for my boss, and I don't think it was unique in my laboratory. And so they were coming from my boss, but they were actually coming from me. So
Most of the big journals will track their reviewers, and each review is actually scored. And the journals vary with the scoring system, but they score their reviewers, and it includes things like turnaround time and the amount of detail, and are the comments biased and so forth. And reviewers will be added or dropped based on that. So if you want to get involved, especially early in career, volunteer to be a reviewer, but take it seriously, turn it around quickly, look at reviews that you've received and model it after it. If the journal has a website set of instructions to reviewers, because some of them do, follow those. But this is a great way to get some practice. It's a great way to hone your skills as a writer. It also gets you noticed, and you may eventually get invited to become part of an editorial board, which is a lot of work, or it may get you invited into other aspects of academia, including committee work and so forth. So the review process that goes on behind the scenes is often as complex as it is the authorship that goes on the front side.
yeah, that's very good comments.
There's also several processes within our organization that offer opportunities to sort of hone your skills as a reviewer. I know the research and development team has asked for a variety of folks to review for their grants. Our teach team. If you're ever interested in that, we usually send it out to our teach membership, asking if folks would like to help. I usually get asked to be as a part of this leadership team for the GEA, the AAMC's Group on Educational Affairs. And so you're reviewing for big national grants, but the leader who's asked is asked to pull together a team. So we're in that process right now, and some of you are involved in that as well. So where you get some experience doing those reviews, and sometimes we offer a group peer review process to where you can pair up with somebody who's a little bit higher level. Francis is one of our reviewers this year. So you could pair up with somebody like that, and then you learn some of the review process as a part of that.
If you're in a clinical department and are looking for the subject for a journal club, which many departments hold, ask one of your faculty members who has recently done a review to provide to the audience the blinded manuscript. Ask them to go through and think about what they would review. And then when the journals make a decision, most of the times the reviewers are notified about the decision that was made on the manuscript they reviewed. And you can see the comments that you made along with the other reviewers. And you can then share those reviews with the journal club audience to give them some feedback on what the actual process did and whether the paper got accepted or not. So it's an interesting way to figure out a novel journal club if you are ever in the setting where you're in a clinical department that does those.
Yeah, that's a cool idea.
Can be a lot of fun, but you do have to respect the privacy of the authors. The good news is with today's blinded reviews, the authors have to submit a paper that is blinded and hides their names and affiliations, and so it's much easier to do now than it once was.
So you agree, Dr. Smith? Yeah, because when I early on in my career, you knew exactly who the people were and who was not necessarily who reviewed it, but you could figure it out.
It was certainly the rule until literally the past couple of years that the reviewers knew who the authors were and what the institution was and so forth. And if you'd been publishing in that area, and especially if it was a narrow area, you pretty much knew who the likely reviewers were. And that still does occur. I recently reviewed a paper where I had pretty much figured out who the authors were likely to be, happened to be sitting at a meeting, and the authors were sitting behind me talking about the review they'd just gotten, and it was clear that it'd been clearly I did not disclose that I knew more about the manuscript than they were talking about publicly. But yes, it is true, but that has become much more blinded than it once was, and that's a good thing.
Right. So one thing we haven't talked about, but I think we should start one here, is there's things called writing groups. And so it's where folks get together and they kind of meet, and they have to be there for an hour, and they kind of work together. You write on what you're working on. It's not you're working on the same thing. And I know that's one of the things I thrive, with our affiliation with UVA and Virginia Tech. Wanted to get like a writing group here, I think, in the Roanoke area. And it's probably not a bad thing for us to be thinking about getting started. Maybe you already have one, Sherry. I don't know.
We don't currently have one. We've teetered around for a bit. We did a few years ago. But it's something we've definitely been considering. It's just like a shared space. Some families do it, like they'll do reading times together, and they'll just go to the same place and read all different things, but they're at least reading. So this is like a similar concept. You're writing, but you're all independently writing. And then sometimes there are some experts there, like a biostatistician or a librarian or somebody like that can, because everybody is at different stages in the writing process. So that can be helpful.
Any last words about somebody that just recently had a paper accepted? Their experience?
I had kind of a general question. I really appreciated your presentation, first off. I definitely learned a lot. But when you were discussing negative data, I was wondering how you approach or if journals even accept data that's non-significant.
Well, yeah, so there is a difference. So if it's negative, it has to be still statistically sound. And so I want to confuse those two. And so that's what this was, is that it was negative data, but it was statistically, at a p-value. So if it went in the other direction of what had been sort of in as I'll say, the dogma.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
But
There are also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I wish more people did that. I know, like, you'll go to these big scientific meetings, and a lot of people in the room know that the data is not that strong, but it just keeps on getting perpetuated, usually by the same group, and it's not good science.
In the project, doesn't take any less time just because you didn't get the results that you expected. And there are some journals, I know of at least one that used to do it regularly, at least once a year. They would do one edition that was dedicated to like surprises. So when you didn't get the results that you anticipated, but they had a whole journal issue on those surprise results, which was really fun.
That's kind of cool. Thank you.
It was called Perspectives Medical Education, I think. Well, if there are no more questions, this has been great, Francis. What a wonderful discussion. And I thank you for everybody who participated and those who just were here to listen and get some information to take with you. I hope this was practical and that you could use this information for your next manuscript or manuscripts to come. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay warm. So sorry, Francis, did you want to say anything else?
Comments, especially Dr. Smith. That was very insightful to know that we have that resource here at Brilliant Clinic.
Absolutely. Thank you all.